Uh, so for today's lesson, we're going to be looking at another Jātaka story. And in the 4 Jātaka stories that we've chosen for this course, I've been trying to select stories that are of interest and that have an intrinsic like value and worth, but also ones that will display something of the variety and the details of the different kinds of things that we find in the Jātakas, to try to show how diverse the collection is. So the first story we looked at, the story of the merchants crossing the desert and encountering the Yaka who managed to persuade one caravan to abandon their goods and another caravan to survive. And this was a kind of a morality tale in a way, but also one that reflected the commercial conditions and the rise of trade in that era. All right, so yeah, the first one was about the merchants crossing the desert. And so we learned something about the relationship of the Jātakas to the especially commercial world as it was changing at the time. The second one we looked at, the Katahari Jataka, was the story of the young girl who had a son by the king, and the story of how the king was persuaded to accept the son as his own. And in that one, I argued that the story reflected a lot of deep mythological motifs and the kinds of like universal or very ancient motifs that to me suggest that it may be contain memories, apart from anything else, contain memories of the Aryan arrival of Aryan culture into India. Then the third one we looked at, oh yeah, that's right, the Underbhuta Jataka, where we saw the rather disturbing story of the Brahmin and the king and their abduction of that poor girl and bringing her up in the tower because of gambling, and how this was construed as being in some way her fault, and sort of gives us a kind of an insight into like how misogyny works and how no matter what happens, it's one of the things that it's easy to tell about misogyny is that no matter what happens, it's her fault. And I was just reading that's right, I was reading just yesterday a comment by someone said something that Jordan Peterson said, in fact, and he said something like, oh yeah, when he had an all-meat diet and was addicted to some kind of drugs and asked to be put into a coma by some dodgy Russian thing, and then he managed to blame his wife's illness on this. Say, oh yeah, it was his wife's sickness that drove me to it, or something like that. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's on brand. That's how that works. Somehow, no matter how stupid the choices that men make, it always has to be the woman's fault. So that's and with raising these things, because it's important to acknowledge that this is a part of the Buddhist tradition. And it's not the whole of the Buddhist tradition. It's not like everybody just kind of acts like this, but it is there, and we can't pretend that somehow that it's not. So for the final talk this evening, or this afternoon, or whenever it is for you, we're going to look at the Samudra Wanija Jataka, which offers, I think, yet another example of a very interesting Jataka story. This one's somewhat longer than the previous one, so I'll get to starting to read it shortly. But this one, in some ways, is kind of a full circle, because it's in some ways similar to the first one we looked at. Also involves merchants in some way, and also involves like that dichotomy of like good and bad spirits giving good and bad advice. So there's certainly some parallels with the first one, but it has it's actually an incredibly good parable for climate change, and like a really interesting, a lot of like really interesting details when it comes to thinking about climate change. And one of the key purposes to which Jātakas have historically been used in Buddhism was as teaching stories, especially for kids. And this is something that I've actually done on a number of occasions, is use this particular story as a way of bringing up climate change and discussing it with kids, also with adults as well. And I think like doing it through the lens of a story allows us to explore issues in a way that's maybe, you know, we can bring up things that might be upsetting or disturbing, but the fact that it's kind of wrapped up in a story lets us kind of contain those emotions to some degree. So one of the things that I want to try to do for you today is not to just convey the story, but also to convey some of the ways in which I think that this can be useful for discussions about climate change. You know, I've talked about climate change from a Buddhist perspective for 20 years, more than 20 years now. And one of the things that I've learned over time is if you want to do a talk on climate change, one of the good things about doing a talk on climate change is that the research is really easy. If you want to mention a few horrifying things that are happening, you just have to look at yesterday's news. And invariably, there's a litany of stories that have come out yesterday that are all terrifying. And let me show you an example. So in just the last couple of days, we've seen temperatures of 52.2 degrees in Saudi Arabia. This is in springtime. 51.1 in Iran. 51.6 in the United Arab Emirates. 37 degrees in springtime at dawn in Greece. 35 degrees in Siberia. 35 in Siberia. And we've seen records broken by 3 degrees or 4. These are, by the way, Celsius, obviously. We've seen records broken by 3 degrees or 4 degrees at multiple places. Not averages broken, but records broken by 3 degrees or 4 degrees in the Pacific Islands and in other places in the world, just in the last couple of days. So that's just in the last day or two. We also had a report out that just surfaced about a day or two with a new assessment of sea level rise projections pointing to the likelihood of a 12-meter sea level rise by the end of the century. And this, of course, is horrifying. Having said which, it is in line with projections that were made by James Hansen 20 years ago. So it should not be entirely unprecedented. 12-meter sea level rise. So just yesterday we were in a coastal town in Sri Lanka, and the monastery we're in was flooded, and there's all mud everywhere and so on. And that's now. That's not with 12 meters rise. Meanwhile, global atmospheric CO2 is steadily above 430 parts per million and is rising faster than ever. Global emissions continue to rise despite all of our efforts to try to do something about that. The Amazon is being demolished at a rate faster than ever. Deep sea fishing and trawling of the ocean bottoms are still happening at a horrifying rate. And, I could keep on going for quite some time. Another one is that we recently passed the mark. I think the last 24 months have had an average global temperature of 1.59 degrees, so almost 1.6 degrees continuously for 24 months now. So that's where we're at, and you're probably sitting there going, "That's a lot." Hopefully, you're sitting there going, "That's a lot." Hopefully, you're sitting there going, "That's too much." Yes, you're quite correct. It is too much. It's horrifying, and there's none of us who can take on all of this and really understand it. If we think we understand it, we're not really seeing the full picture. It's too big, it's too much. Even a lot of the climate scientists I know are like that. They can't watch the news, they can't see things. And while the climate continues to break down at an accelerating rate, our capacity to do anything about that is being systematically demolished by extreme right-wing governments, as is our capacity to even know that it is happening through the annihilation of science. And all of these things are happening simultaneously. So look, I don't have any solutions. I just want you to know, if you're coming to me for solutions, I'm sorry. If you I've been doing climate activism my whole life, literally since I was 18. I started doing environmental work, and I don't know. I don't see it. If you want to ask me, people often say, "Well, what can we do? What is the solution?" Look, if you want to know the only actual thing, in my view, that can actually make a difference is you have to take government, and use government power to shut down the fossil fuel industry. That's the only thing we can actually reasonably do. So, if you want my advice on what you can do practically, that's that. All right. I'll leave that up to you if you want to just make that happen. But for those of us that do live still in democracies, then I would urge us to, when it comes time to exercising our voice in our democracies, to not just think about ourselves. And I think we live in a time where it has become sort of politically normal that people think that everyone just votes from their own self-interest. And I don't think that's true. I think, yes, of course, people do vote from their own self-interest, but they also vote because of broader moral concerns. And I think that it's really important for us to reflect about that and to remember that the kids today, right, literally Gen Alpha kids today who are alive will see if that sea level rise of 12 meters happens, they'll be alive, and that is real, if they make it that far. So this is something where we have to think outside of ourselves and not just motivated by selfish actions. Anyway, look, I could keep going on this theme for quite some time, but let's have a look at the Jātaka story. Rob, if you could pull up the sort of central link with the verses, and we will quickly look at the verses before going to the story. So this again is the verses as we have seen in the previous classes, which usually give the kernel of the story. And in this particular example is a good example of how those verses are used. In some cases, we've seen where the verses were like added extra to the story or used in different ways, whereas here they kind of actually do summarize the story quite nicely. Those folks sow and reap, men living off the fruit of their work. They have no share of this island. This is better far than India. And so one of the things we can see from that is that while the verse itself makes perfect sense, but the context of the verse is only really clear once you know the story. So this is a verse that was spoken by a castaway on a desert island about how nice it was. Then the next verse, when the 15th day full moon has risen, there will be a great flood from the sea, drowning this splendid isle. Let it not destroy you all. Go to some other haven. So this is the words of advice from the righteous God. Never shall a mighty flood of water from the sea drown this splendid isle. I have seen that through many a sign. Do not fear. Why worry? Celebrate. So this is the other advice. You've come to this splendid abode full of food and drink. I see no danger for you at all. Celebrate, even unto the sons of sons. There's God in the southern. So this is the two gods who have now spoken. And now we have the words of a foolish refugee. This God in the southern quarter crying, it is safe. His is the truth. The northern doesn't know if there's danger or not. Don't fear. Why worry? Celebrate. Just to sort of point out, like you can see, like the psychology that he's using about here, right? So the first one is that the foolish speaker is like saying, well, we don't know, right? You can see how this kind of parallels the climate denialist rhetoric, right? Oh, well, we don't really know. It's just a theory and so on. Don't fear. So like, it's like the problem is yours, right? You're the problem because you're afraid, and that's your fear, and that's your problem. And so I find people do this to me a lot. Happened to me the other day, just from a friend of mine. Says, oh, it's your fear. No, it's not just. Yes, I'm afraid. I'm afraid because terrifying things are happening. And if you're not afraid, I don't know. I feel like you're probably in denial. Anyway, moving on. As these spirits argue, one reporting danger, one safety, please heed my advice, lest we perish swift and fleet. Let us all join together to build a boat, a strong vessel fully equipped. If this southern one speaks true and is falsely rejected by the northern, it shall serve us in times of need. and we would not give up the island. But if the northern speaks true and is falsely rejected by the southern, then having all boarded the boat, we shall cross safely to the far shore. Truly, best not accept the last word that came your way, when what was spoken by the first was best. Who here accepts the truth after examination, that man goes to the best place. Okay, so in this one, so sorry, Rob, if you can go back to those verses, just briefly comment on these verses. So you can see that the wise person is giving us a conditional argument. Basically, whether it happens or not, building the boat is still a good thing. And so this is, of course, has always been the argument of the environmental movement, that regardless, even if you don't believe climate change is real, obviously it is real, but if you reject that reality, it's still good to not pollute the environment and to create a clean energy resource. So, why not do that? So that kind of conditional argument. And then, but also the thing, like, don't just accept the last word when what was spoken by the first was best. So here it's kind of pointing to the kind of recency bias and the way that information is manipulated, not by what is true or what is reasonable or what is in line with the facts, by what simply you've heard last, or perhaps what you've heard the most. And so this idea of like flooding the information zone with rubbish in order to convince people is already being hinted at here. So one who accepts the truth after examination, right? So the idea that we have to reflect to understand what is the right thing to do. So then, so that's where the verses end the story, right? So we're kind of left at a bit of a cliffhanger there. We've got the different advice, but we're not really told in the verses, in the spoken verses themselves. Now then at the end of those spoken verses is added another few verses which are editorializing verses that are attributed to the Buddha. Just as in the middle of the watery sea the merchants fled to safety by their own efforts, so realizing his future welfare, he of vast wisdom transgresses not at all. Fools deluded by desire for taste, not realizing their future welfare, sink down in face of present need like those in mid-ocean. So here again, pointing to what I think is a very contemporary point, that we are deluded by desire for tastes. We are caught up in having those things that we want and enjoying those luxuries that we've got used to. And oh, by the way, did I mention that like the prices of oranges has like gone up by double in Europe, and because of climate change and a whole bunch of other things. Actually, food prices are already feeling the pinch because of climate change. Olive oil is another one. Anybody likes olive oil? Who doesn't like olive oil? Got some bad news for you. And so all of these things are actually one by one being affected by floods, by drought, by fire. And we don't really kind of notice it in the kind of scheme of things because it happens erratically, and because most of us in developed countries are kind of insulated from a lot of these things. But over time, they will ramify and cascade and become undeniable. Prepare for what must be done in the future, thinking, let what must be done not harm me on the day the duty ripens. The kind who acts to prepare what must be done is not harmed by what must be done on the day the duty ripens. Okay, so here the advice being that we should prepare for the future, right? Because what we do now has consequences for the future. So we act today so that we do not experience those bad consequences in the future. One of the things that I've noticed doing a lot of climate change work and a lot of environmental work for nearly 40 years now is I've gone to really kind of dislike this whole rhetoric around saving the planet. Like, this is kind of the whole thing, oh, we've got to save the planet, we've got to do this. Like the planet was doing fine for a long time before we came along. And people are like, oh, we've got to plant trees, we've got to do things, we've got to do this and that. But like, there's like a lot of trees in the world. And there has been for a long time. And they don't actually need us to go around and plant them. What they need is for us to stop chopping them down. And as soon as we start saying we're going to plant trees, I can guarantee you that's covering another project, which is going and chopping the trees down. And that's how these things work. And so rather than focusing on us as the savior who has a mission to make everything green and make everything environmental and so on, we have to focus on not destroying things. And if we just don't ruin things, things will be fine. Actually, the environment is incredibly resilient. Nature is unbelievably adaptive, but she has limits. So we have to respect those limits and work within them. Anyway, let's move to the story now, Rob. We can look at the story on Venerable Ananda Jyoti's site. And again, hopefully we're familiar with this now, but just to reiterate, like normally for sutta translations, then obviously I would use sort of central. And actually, it's been really nice going around Sri Lanka and just seeing like a lot of monks and a lot of students and so on who are using sort of central on a daily basis. So that's really nice to see. But in terms of the Jātakas specifically, then the best resource on the web and the best resource anywhere, as far as I know, is Venerable Ananda Jyoti's site. And I think he's still kind of an ongoing project of doing more things. And so he's really, I think, enriched the scholarship on the Jātakas in recent years. And I hope, honestly, my hope is that he will completely retranslate all of the Jātaka stories, but he's only one person. So anyway, we'll see. Let's just scroll down a little bit. We won't read the background story. Keep going to the black text, Rob. Okay. So I'll read through the story, and because it's a slightly long one, I'll do some commentary along the way. And please do pop any questions into chat. I've got my chat open here, and I will be checking that as I'm going. So please put questions into chat, and I will answer them if I can. In the past, when Brahmadatta was king of Benares, there stood near Benares a great town of carpenters containing 1,000 families. The carpenters from this town used to profess that they would make a bed or a chair or a house, and after receiving a large advance from men's hands, they proved able to make nothing whatever. The people used to upbraid every carpenter they met with and interfered with them. So those debtors were so much harassed that they couldn't live there no longer. Let us go to some foreign land, they said, and find some place or other to dwell in. So to the forest they went. Okay, so first of all, look, I don't know what it's like in the US, okay? But if you're in Australia, you're looking at this description of how tradies were. In Australia, we call them tradies, right? You work builders, sparkies, aka electricians, plumbers, and so on. So this description of tradies rings very true. And this is exactly the kind of thing that still happens. So you can see, oh, you pay them, they just don't actually come up with anything. So anyway, moving down, they cut down trees, built a mighty ship, launched her in the river. Interesting that they weren't able to make a chair, but they can make a ship. Shows what you can do if you put your mind to it. Took her away from that town at a distance of from some 3/4 of a league. They laid her up. Then in the middle of the night, they returned to the town to fetch their families. They conveyed on board ship and proceeded in due course to the ocean. Okay, a large ship. Remember, there's 1,000 families. There they sailed at the wind's will until they reached an island that lay in the midst of the sea. So hang on, let me just come back to that. So the ship was big enough for 1,000 families, right? It's a large ship, obviously, right? Now, whether or not they actually had ships that were big enough for 1,000 families that could sail on the Ganges River, I do not know. Seems like a lot, but what it does show you is that they certainly were thinking in those terms, right? They had this idea of boats that could be seafaring vessels with very large numbers of passengers on them. They sailed at the wind's will until they reached an island that lay in the midst of the sea. Okay, so kind of an interesting story. So you can see how this story would have like, genuine memories in it of like travelers' adventures and so on. This one doesn't really seem, it's not like in the first Jataka where it was a merchant caravan. They were going across the desert, but they were going to somewhere they knew. Here they're just leaving and exploring. I mean, that story is actually not dissimilar to the story of the founding of Sri Lanka by Vijaya, who left on a boat from the Bay of Bengal, from the Ganges mouth, and then sailed south and found Sri Lanka. Maybe the island here is Sri Lanka, maybe not. Maybe it's perhaps one of the Andaman Islands or something like that, a number of islands in that area. But it's kind of interesting that this idea of like escaping civilization to go to some unspoiled paradise was already true in those days. In that island grew all manner of wild plants and wild fruit trees, rice, sugarcane, banana, mango, jumbo plum, jack, coconut, and whatnot. There was another man who had been shipwrecked and had taken possession of that island before them and lived therein, eating the rice and enjoying the sugarcane and all the rest, by which he had grown stout and sturdy. Naked he went, and his hair and beard were grown long. The carpenters thought, if yonder island is haunted of Jātakas, we shall all perish, so we'll explore it. Then 7 brave and strong men armed with the 5 kinds of weapons and disembarked and explored that island. At that moment, the castaway had just broken his fast and drunk of the juice of the sugarcane, and in high contentment was lying on his back in a lovely spot, cool in the shade on some sand which glistened like silver plate. And he was thinking, no such happiness as this have they who dwell in Jambudipa, that is in India, that plough and sow. Better to me is this island than Jambudipa. He uttered this exalted utterance and was at the height of bliss. The teacher, to explain how this castaway uttered this exalted utterance, repeated the first verse. So the exalted utterance, of course, here is the dāna, which we know from the book of the same name. Others sow and others plough, living by the sweat of the brow. In my realm they have no share. Jambudipa, this better far. All right, so here, I love this bit because this shows that like going for a holiday in a tropical resort is like an ancient kind of thing. I mean, this is literally most people's or many people's idea of bliss, right? Lie on the beach, drinking a Mai Tai, and just not having to work and enjoying a bit of coconut and some mango. I mean, our ideas of the pleasant, delightful, blissful experience haven't really changed all that much. And so this guy who's living there is living in a state which is either a state of like primitive Aboriginal purity or in a state of staying in a resort on Phuket or something, or, you know, somewhere in between the two. Okay. The scouts said, let's make acquaintance with him. Following the sound, they came upon the man, but his aspect horrified them. It is the Yaka, they cried, and put arrow to bow. I'm just going to, I mean, like the whole idea that you're lying around on the beach and your personal grooming goes out the window also is still a modern day phenomenon. But moving on. Arrow to bow, when the man saw them, he was in fear of being wounded, so he cried out, no Yakas, but a man, spare my life. What? They said, do men go all naked and defenseless like you? They asked him again and again, only to receive the same answer. At last they approached him and all began to talk pleasantly together. The newcomers asked how he came there. The others told him the truth of it. As a reward for your good deeds, you've come here, said he. This is a first-rate island. There is no need here to work with your hands for a living, of rice and sugarcane and all the rest. There is no end here, all growing wild. You may live here without anxiety. Is there nothing else, they asked, to hinder our living here? No fear is there but this. The isle is haunted by amanusas, by non-human spirits, and the non-human spirits would be incensed to see the excretions of your bodies. So when you would relieve yourselves, dig a hole in the sand and hide it there. That's the only danger. There is no other. Only always be careful on this point. All right, so again, kind of interesting. I find like the precision of like the parallels with our modern times to be very curious. Like so many precise and so detailed. So one thing is that this guy, in some sense, is an Aboriginal. Right? He was the first person who's living there. He's the indigenous population of the island, and he's the one who's, when other people come to the island, he's like, oh, sure, we can all share. And then he offers some fairly modest sage advice, right? Just don't crap everywhere and you'll be fine. And again, we've been told these things by Indigenous peoples around the world for such a long time. And it still remains to this day the case that the front line of preventing environmental devastation, whether it's in Australia or in the US or in the Amazon or in Indonesia or in so many places around the world, the front line is occupied by Indigenous peoples, because it's their lands that are being decimated, their livelihoods destroyed, and often them physically being destroyed. And the people in the world who have the least and who have the least in terms of resources and have contributed the least to the problem are the ones who are the most aware of the problem and have been offering us solutions this whole time. The reality is that the solution to the problems of climate change are not that difficult. Really, it's not that hard. Just bury your shit and just don't use too much. And somehow that can't even be in the conversation. Like the whole time that I've been a monk, the whole time I've been looking at climate change news, I've been reading climate change news probably every day just about for 20 years or more. And I don't think I've ever seen anyone in any mainstream position saying that the solution is to use less stuff. Okay. Hi, sorry, am I back now? Yep, good. So sorry about that. The Wi-Fi just died here. There's a bit of a storm happening outside. Ironically enough, there is a storm happening outside, which is then stopping us. I mean, it looks nice, I have to admit, but it seems to be interfering with the Wi-Fi. I'm now on my phone, so hopefully this will work. Okay. Thank you, Mao, for giving me that update. Yes, so I was saying that as far as I'm aware, I don't really see people in mainstream leadership or media or anything like that actually talking about using less. It's always how can we somehow just have everything that we want and not have to pay the price of it. Anyway, let us move ahead. So so they took up their abode. Now there were two master workmen, one at the head of each 500 families, and one of these was foolish and greedy of the best food, the other one wise and not bent on getting the best of everything. Really important sentence here, actually, right? This is the first way of discerning something about someone's character, right? One of them is always has to get the best of everything. And the other one's like, okay, whatever, right? And I think probably all of us know people who are like this, and know people who everything has to be the best, and has to have the best food, and have to have the best car, and have the best clothes. And we've always been kind of conditioned that having more and having the best of everything is, well, that's what life is about. But this is a test of character. When you see that, this is a sign. What kind of person is this? What are their values? What matters to this person's life? All right, moving on. Right, in the course of time, they continued to dwell there, all grew stout and sturdy. Then they thought, we have not been merry men this long time. And Venerable Ananda Jyoti has a little note there. Basically, it's a kind of a confusing, it's an odd idiom there, but it seems to mean that they haven't been drinking. So we'll make some toddy from juice of the sugar cane. So they caused a strong drink to be made, and being drunken sang, danced, sport, and then in thoughtlessness relieved themselves here, there, and everywhere without hiding it, so that they made the island foul and disgusting. Sorry, I'm not sure. There's a beeping. I'm not sure if you guys are hearing it or where it's coming from. Anyway, so Well, that kind of thing still happens at parties these days when people get drunk, so that hasn't changed very much. For those of you not familiar with toddy and how to make it, toddy is made from spiking a coconut palm. It's not made from the juice of the coconut tree, or coconut fruit. It's made by spiking the palm, and then you get a sugary liquid from it, and you can leave it overnight, and it will ferment and become toddy. That heedlessness, like the intoxication, right? And so these days, of course, we still have alcohol for intoxication, a wide variety of other kinds of drugs as well, but also other things that create that intoxication, especially media, social media, all of these distractions that we have that hide the truth from us. They manufacture delusion and hide the truth from us. The deities were incensed because these men made their playing place all foul. Shall we bring the sea over? They deliberated, and cleanse the island. This is the dark fortnight. Now our gathering is broken up. Well, on the 15th day from now, at the first of the full moon, at the time of the moon's rising, we will bring up the sea and make an end of them all. Thus they fixed the day. At this, a righteous Devaputta, who was one of them, thought, I would not that these should perish before my eyes. So in his compassion, at the time when the men were sitting at their doors in pleasant converse after their evening meal, he made the whole island one blaze of light, and adorned in all splendor, stood poised in the air towards the north, and spoke to them thus. O you carpenters, the deities are angry with you. Dwell no longer in this place, for in half a month from this time the deities will bring up the sea and destroy you, one and all. Therefore flee from this place. And you repeated the second verse. In thrice 5 days the moon will rise to view, and then from the sea a mighty flood is due, this mighty island to overwhelm. Then haste, elsewhere take shelter that it not hurt you. So a question there from Giordano. I thought Devas had virtuous conduct, and if so, why would they kill others? Well, I think Devas are kind of a mixed bunch. In this case, I think they are spirits of the island, right? They're spirits of place. So this is actually like a major thing. Like in Vedic and Indian mythology, there are different kinds of deities. Some are not deities of place. Some are deities of, say, the thunderstorm or of the sun. Others are deities of abstract concepts. But then there's also deities of particular places, who typically are these kind of native spirits or yakas and so on. And their job is to defend their place and to defend their local environment. And that story, the story of humanity attacking a local environment, goes back even a long way before the Jātakas. In fact, to the oldest of all myths is the story of Gilgamesh. And in the story of Gilgamesh, the first adventure that Gilgamesh goes on with his buddy Enkidu as they go to the forests of Lebanon, where they encounter the great monster Humbaba, who is clearly described as being a representative of a native, like a spirit of a native tribe living, an African tribe living in Lebanon at the time. And they go to fell the cedar to build their palace. And so how do they overcome Humbaba? Can they defeat this mighty monster in battle? No. They overcome him by coming close, whispering nice words into his ears, and then sliding a knife into his belly and betraying him. That's how they do it. That's how it was 5,000 years ago, and that's how it still is today. So Devas, if they're acting in defense of their land, to their point of view, yes, they are acting righteously. They think it's the right thing to do. But the difference is, of course, that one of the Devas, as we've seen here, genuinely holds the best interests of the people at heart. And so he's not saying that they weren't going to flood the place, but he is trying to help them to escape. Okay. All right, so the first one gives a good advice. And another comrade of his, a cruel Devaputta, thought, perhaps they will follow his advice and escape. I'll prevent their going and bring them all utter destruction. So adorned in divine splendor, He made a great blaze of light over the whole place. Approaching them, remained poised in the air towards the south. As he asked, has there been a Devaputta here? There has. What has he told you? They answered, thus and thus, my lord. He said, this God does not wish you to live here, and in anger speaks. Go not elsewhere, but stay even here. With these words, he repeated 2 verses. And we've already seen the verses in my translation previously, so this is the older translation. To me, by many signs, it is made clear that mighty ocean flood of which you hear, never shall this great island overwhelm. Then take your pleasure, grieve not, never fear. Here you shall lit upon a wide abode, full of all things to eat, of drink and food. I see no danger for you. Come, enjoy unto all generations this your good. Having thus in 2 verses offered to relieve their anxiety, right? And again, you can see how this is kind of very similar to the denialist narrative, right? They're all saying, "Oh, you're scaring the children by telling them these stories about climate change." Anyway, so some kinds of fear and anxiety are actually useful, especially if it saves your life. Being afraid of scary things is actually reasonable. Actually, this kind of reminds me of another point that we have to think about in this area, right? Like normally we think that emotions like anxiety, fear, dread, depression, and so on, that we normally think, well, these things are bad things because we don't like to experience them, they're suffering. But of course, they all play some kind of purpose. And even though they might often be dysfunctional, that is to say, they don't really achieve the purpose, then it's still kind of reasonable to feel that. So like fear is something that's like, you're in the jungle and then there's I'll tell you an example of that. We stopped by the side of the road a couple of days ago. There was an elephant bathing in a lotus pond. Beautiful, and just to see this magnificent creature just in the lotus pond in the evening, enjoying, I mean, what could be nicer? A classic Indian sight. And he begins to move, shake his lotuses around, and gradually begins to emerge from the water. And you can see like a huge bulk of this creature coming out of the water. And it's great. We're taking photos, and we're like, oh, good, he's coming closer. We can take better photos. And then he's like turns like directly towards us, and then like starts sort of marching fairly purposefully in our direction. And all the drivers and all the local people were like, okay, time to go. So we're going to So yeah, we got in the car quite quickly. Actually, they showed us a video that one of the guys who we were with, we're driving through a remote area of Sri Lanka where there's a lot of elephants coming onto the roads and so on. And he showed us a video that they'd made of the previous trip down that same highway. And they'd been stopped by the elephants who'd somehow managed to get their trunk into the car. And they were like filming this elephant's trunk forcing its way through the window of the car into the car and like rummaging around while all the people were scampering around inside the car. And the elephant was trying to get the food that it liked. They gave it some watermelon to try to get rid of it, but it didn't want watermelon. So it got rid of that. And then, so yeah. So some kinds of fear do serve a purpose. But the problem that we have today is that we have this fear and it's bottled up. We don't know what we can do about it. We feel powerless. And this is really, that's where that fear sort of curdles and turns into anxiety. And that narrative of powerlessness is like at the basis of a lot of our emotional dysfunction around climate change and similar issues. And we can see that in this particular instance, that in the story, that is alleviated by actually doing something, right? So the creation of a boat or a way of escaping. Let's have a look. Let's read some more of the Jātaka before we go on. Okay, so those two Devas are given their words, and the foolish carpenter said, lifted up his voice and said, that God who from the southern quarter clear cries out all safe, from him the truth we hear, fear or fear not, the northern knows no wit. Why grieve then? Take your pleasure, never fear. Hearing him, the 500 carpenters who were greedy of good things incline to the counsel of the foolish carpenter. Again, really interesting to see that this is the kind of the root cause of these things, is the fact that you just enjoy having nice things. And it's something that seems harmless. Like, I mean, they're just eating some coconuts and lying on the beach, enjoying their nice tropical island, right? I mean, who's to criticize, right? What's wrong with that? It's something I think about a lot, actually. Like whenever I'm in Sydney, you walk around on the streets, I go through, like I'm living in Little India, and I walk through the streets and you see like families going down, or people going out for dinner, or just going shopping, or going off to work. And you see like what are they doing wrong? Like, no, there's nothing wrong with any of these things. There's nothing wrong with wanting to enjoy a nice meal, or to have safety and security for your family, or in order to be prosperous and have a nice life. And so we're living in this way where we're doing these things that it doesn't feel like there's anything wrong with them. It actually feels fine. No, it's good, actually. It's good to do those things. And yet somehow, because of the consequences of those things, they're all going to be taken away. All the things that we wanted. On hearing him, the 500 carpenters who were greedy of good things inclined to the counsel of the foolish carpenter, but then the wise carpenter refused to hearken to his saying and addressed the carpenter's repeated 4 verses. While these 2 Yakas against each other cry, one calling fear, one security, come here advice, let's soon and out of hand you altogether perish utterly. Let us all join to build a mighty bark, a vessel stout, and place within this ark all fittings, if this southern spoke the truth, and the other simple folly of the mark, this vessel for us good at need shall be. Nor will we leave this isle incontinent, but if the northern spake truthfully, the southern did but foolishness present, then in the ship we all embark together, and where our safety lies, all hie us there. Take not for best or worse what you first hear, but whoso lets all pass within the ear, and then deliberating takes the mean, the man to safest harborage will steer. So again, sorry, Rob, if you can stay with the verses for just one second. So you can see, of course, a very significant motif of the ark. And this is obviously a version of the flood and the ark story, which is one of those mythic archetypes which is very widely spread around the world. The flood myth itself comes from ancient Mesopotamia. I think does it come from the Epic of Gilgamesh? I'm not sure if it's Gilgamesh or a separate story, but anyway, so it's a very old pre-biblical mythology. In one respect, obviously you can say that such stories could easily arise because, well, floods are very widespread. Lots of places have floods and lots of people try to escape from those floods in boats. So that's not in itself a sign that there's any necessarily literally connection between them. But I think at the very least, it shows that this kind of idea that of the flood as being this destructive force. I mean, in you can see this in the suttas a lot. Imagery of flood is very destructive throughout the suttas, and in particular in suttas like the Dhanya Sutta, living near the river Mahi, which is one of the most flood-prone rivers in Bihar. Or in the Parayanavagga, where the 16 ascetics are staying near the Godavari River, again, extremely flood-prone river. And their dialogues and the teachings revolve a lot around that threat of a flood. So here is a kind of the flood in the absolute sense, right? That it's not just a part of the land will be flooded, but that the whole land will be gone. Moving on. Thanks, Rob. Great. And as he said, come now, let us follow the words of both the deities. Let us build a ship, and if the words of the first be true, into that ship we shall climb and depart, but if the words of the other be true, we shall put the ship out of the way and dwell here. All right, so again, offering this is a re-expression in prose of the same if-then logic which we find in the poetry. And it's kind of interesting also to show that that the counsel of the wise person is not just in accordance with the truth, but it's also kind of very reasonable. Like the wise one is looking for common ground, right? He's not saying, well, this is definitely must be happening and everyone else is wrong, but he's saying, well, look, I think this is going to happen, but even if it doesn't. And so there's this kind of more, it's not just in accordance with the facts, but it's also there's something more generous spirited about the way that he looks at things. But then the foolish carpenter said, go to, you see a crocodile in a teacup. Great image there, right? You're seeing a crocodile in a teacup. Obviously, they didn't have teacups in ancient India, just so we're clear. They did have cups, a drinking water cup. And when I see that image, I always put a note in my mind. Oh yeah, I've got to use that one. Yes, I've got to remember that. The next one is kind of curious. The translation says you are far too slow. The Pali is ativa dighang pasasi. Literally, you see. Literally, your translation would you see far too long. That's a literal translation. You see far too long. Ativa dighang pasasi. Ativa dighang pasasi. You see far too long. I think it's a mistranslation. I think the sense of it should be that you're thinking too far ahead in the future. Right? We just have to live for today. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. That's what I think he's saying. The first Devaputta spoke in anger against us. The second in affection. Again, to kind of notice this kind of ad hominem kind of arguments, whereas the first was trying to say, well, let's listen to both and let's kind of do something which is wise in either circumstance. And then this one is like dividing based on these ad hominem projections. This one's angry, this one's affectionate. Again, this is kind of a manner of argumentation, which should be an immediate red flag. Like when you see somebody making these kinds of arguments, you need to immediately recognize that this is not, that people only make these kinds of arguments when they don't actually have a proper argument to make, right? So the sign, oh my God, Mao has just posted a literal crocodile in a teacup. Now I've literally seen everything. I can go to my grave a happy monk. Okay. All right. Okay, if we leave this choicest of isles, whither shall we go? But if you needs must go, take your tail with you and make your ship. We want no ship, we. So the wise man, with those that followed him, built a ship and put all the fittings aboard, and the whole company stood in the ship. Then on the day of the full moon, at the time of the moon rising, up front of the ocean a wave arose, and knee-deep it swept over the whole island. The wise man, when he observed the rising of the wave, cut loose the ship. Those of the foolish carpenter's party, 500 families they were, sat still, saying to one another, a wave has arisen to sweep over the island, but it will be no deeper. And then the ocean wave arose, waist deep, man deep, deep as a palm tree. How long is a palm tree? How deep is a palm tree? Just looking outside, palm tree is about 12 meters. Yeah. Deep as 7 palm trees, and over the whole island it rolled. The wise man, having skill in means, not snared by greed of good things, departed in safety, but the foolish carpenter, greedy of good things, not regarding the fear of the future, with 500 families was destroyed. So, okay, so then now a few more issues which are raised by this one. First of all, there's the issue of prevention versus adaptation. Right? And this is a major kind of issue within the environmental and climate response movement. Do we try to stop climate change from happening? Ideally, yes, of course. Or do we try to adapt to it? And look, obviously, and so in this particular narrative, the ability to prevent it failed early on when they didn't follow the simple advice, and the option of actually preventing it from happening was taken off the table. And so this I think is a reality that also at some point we have to accept. Like there's always something that you can do to prevent things. It's true. Like you can always make them not worse than they are, right? I mean, it's an ongoing thing. Every liter of petroleum that is burned makes things worse. So we can try to not accelerate making them worse. But there comes a time when the question, like, can we prevent catastrophic outcomes, becomes, well, no, we can't actually. Hard to know when that point is reached, of course. So then the question of adaptation arises. Now, adaptation obviously is necessary, right? If someone's city is flooding, they obviously have to try to prevent that flooding. They obviously have to try to get to higher land and to stop themselves being destroyed. Obviously, you have to do adaptation, but the problem is that then the more adaptation you do, then the more the adaptation is used as a reason to not stop using fossil fuels. And this is something that you see happening countless times. Actually, there was the reasoning behind this was explained really well in a really nice documentary called The Fog of War by Robert McNamara. If you haven't seen it, really worth having a look at. So Robert McNamara was the US Secretary of Defense during the Vietnam War. But one of the stories that he told was before that, he was working for Ford in the 1950s. And they were having a lot of car crashes, and they wanted to figure out, how do you stop people dying in car crashes? So they went to the egg people, and they said, how do you ship eggs around without the eggs breaking? And they said, you have to make sure that the eggs don't move in the cartons. And they said, okay, so we've got to make sure people don't move in the cars. So then they invented the seatbelt. That's how seatbelts were invented. And so they did all these studies to find out, like, how much lives are going to be saved by introducing seatbelts. And then they, presented this and made it law. And so these days, seatbelts are required for safety. But what they found was interesting, that after they introduced them, that the number of fatal accidents decreased as expected, but it didn't decrease to the same degree that they expected. The projections were always that they were going to save, maybe 1,000 lives, and in fact they saved maybe 500 lives or something like that. And then they looked into it to try to ask, why is that? Why did they overestimate? And the reason was because when people have seatbelts on, they feel safer. So there's always this feedback effect. If we go, yes, we'll do these carbon adaptation systems, and we've seen a lot of these things. People talk about clean carbon, right? As a clean carbon doesn't exist. People talk about, like, emissions control schemes, emissions offset schemes, complete waste of time. Emissions offset schemes have accomplished nothing, and they're just an excuse. It was a good paper, again, literally just from yesterday, about the use of planting forests to reduce carbon. And again, making the point that there's no serious study that this has actually achieved anything, because what tends to happen is that when you plant a forest, that somebody else says, great, now we've got more forest, we can chop down this other forest over here. And so you actually end up really just achieving nothing from doing these projects. So a lot of the adaptation that we do, the more adaptation that we do, becomes an excuse for not doing things like carbon emission schemes. Originally, the idea of carbon emission schemes was that if there are some sectors of the economy where we cannot stop using fossil fuels, then for those parts of the economy, we can use offset schemes to then minimize that. But then it became generalized to use for anything, so that we didn't have to actually stop using fossil fuels at all. And so these things will invariably have, when you see these things being touted, when you see proposals and media puff pieces and so on, they will never work as effectively as they are sold as being. They might do something. I'm not saying that all of these schemes are not going to achieve anything, but I am saying that the effects of them is usually much less in the scheme of things. One of the things that I've learned over many years reading these things is just like I know that your individual appetite for destruction is going to be different. So not everybody wants to consume a lot of doom and all of these kinds of things. And not everybody wants to, all of this stuff. And this is something media people know very well. There was somebody from, I think it was one of the heads at CNN, who posted this on Twitter. Somebody asked him, why don't you talk more about climate change? And he just outright said, because whenever we talk about climate change, our ratings go down. That's why they don't talk about it. If you want to know, if you do want to know more about it, the best mainstream media outlet is The Guardian, which generally has good climate coverage. But one thing that I'd also encourage you to do, keep your eye on global atmospheric CO2. So you can Google, does global atmospheric CO2, you can see the daily readings. I'm going to do that right now, in fact. As I said before, it's been up to 430 parts per million, and it's at the NOAA laboratory is the main record that's being kept. The April average was 429.64 parts per million, which is the the April average was 429.64. The previous April was 426.51. So it's risen over 3 parts per million in the last year. And the most recent daily record, May 26, from 2 days ago, is 430.46 parts per million. 430.46 parts per million. One of the reasons why global atmospheric CO2 measurements are so important is because this is the key driver of climate change. And that measure is a very simple one. Often when people talk about these things, they focus on emissions, but emissions are extremely hard to measure, and they're extremely subject to distortion. And most of the parties who are reporting emissions have an interest in misreporting them. That is to say, most governments and most corporations. The only people who don't have a motive to misreport them are the scientists. So emissions are very hard to measure. Just give you one example. In Australia, Australia has massive farmlands. Like, I don't know what the total amount is, but there's a vast amount of farmlands in Australia. And we have essentially no idea what the carbon interchange is on agricultural land in Australia. It varies according to the type of soil, according to the type of farming, according to the time of year, and so on and so forth. And there's very complex measurements of which we really know very little. And I know this because I was in the room with the head of the CSIRO, the Australian Scientific Laboratory, scientific organisation, and the former Governor General of Australia was asking him, pleading with him, let us make a project to measure the CO2 interchange from Australian farmlands. And the head of the CSIRO basically said that they wouldn't do that. And the reason was because the rural community doesn't trust the government. That's basically the reason. So we can't get on the farms, enough of them, to be able to measure it or to even know where are these farms absorbing CO2? Are they emitting CO2? It's really just a guess. So emissions are really hard to measure, right? But global atmospheric CO2 is a nice, hard fact. It's easy to measure. It's been measured consistently in one place since 1958. And that contains all of the good things and all of the bad things are reflected in global CO2. So that anytime you close a coal mine, anytime you reduce emissions, it's reflected in global atmospheric CO2. Anytime you burn down a forest, that's reflected there as well. So it reflects the actual primary physical reality that's driving climate change. So if you want to be able to see at a glance how we're going, this to me is the most reliable, interesting way. All right, moving on, 3 other verses full of instruction, spoken after full awakening, so spoken by the Buddha. As through mid-ocean by deeds they did, the traders they escaped in happiness. So wise men comprehending what lies hid within the future will no jot transgress. Fools in the folly eaten up with greed, who future dangers do not comprehend, sink overwhelmed in face of present need, as these in middest ocean found their end. Accomplish then the deed before the need. Let not lack hurt me of the needful thing. Who timely do the necessary deed, come never into suffering. So much less a literal translation than the one, my translation, which we read earlier, but it gets the point across quite nicely. So when the teacher had finished this, he said, "Not for the first time, monks, that formerly also has Devadatta been ensnared by pleasures of the present without looking to the future." So Devadatta, of course, was the foolish carpenter. Kokalika was the unrighteous Devaputta. So Kokalika was one of the leading followers of Devadatta. Sariputta was a Devaputta who stood in the northern part, and I was myself, that is to say, the Buddha was the wise carpenter. So this is the identification of the birth. So this is the Samudra Vanija Jātaka, the Jataka of the ocean traders. So, okay, thanks, Rob. We can, I think, finish with the screen sharing for now. So we have a little bit of time left, and if there's any questions or anything you'd like to talk about while we have a few minutes, that would be great. Ananda asks about whether the fundamental root cause is their foolishness or ignorance. Well, you can obviously ignorance. I mean, these things always go together, but you can see that like the psychology of how the foolish people in that kind of work. Yeah, first of all, yes, it's ignorance about like but specifically ignorance of the consequences of their actions. So this is number one thing, right? But then that ignorance is actually driven by greed. It's because they enjoy those nice things and they don't want to stop enjoying those nice things, right? And so then you can see there's like there's like a kind of a distinction. I mean, maybe this is more just a sort of nominal distinction, but I see a distinction between avidya and moha. Like avidya is the unknowing, right? Moha is like the force that hides the knowing. So like when you can see that because they have their greed, their attachment to enjoying those nice things now, then the moha is that force that like twists the reality, hides the truth from them. Moha is this active force that hides the truth. And one of the means that moha uses in order to hide the truth is hatred, right? You can see that the bad refugee, remember these guys are refugees, right? So the bad refugee is twisting and dividing people against each other, right? So by promoting hatred is how they get to satisfy their greed. So these things always kind of working together. And again, you know, we see these kinds of dynamics working today all the time. I mean, honestly, it's when I see these things, it really is prescient in terms of like so many details that mapping onto what we're seeing today so very precisely. So like I said, if any of you, you know, if you are teaching groups, especially with groups of kids or something like that, then maybe you can use this story to bring a lot of these issues up. Okay, so yes, so Mao asks about the name of the documentary. Yeah, Fog of War by Robert McNamara. Yeah. Had some interesting things to say. He had, like, after the Vietnam War, he had dinner with the former, his counterpart in Vietnam, who was a Vietnamese defense minister or whatever, long after the war. And they're having dinner next to each other, and they ended up arguing over dinner because the Vietnamese guy was saying, "Oh, you wanted to colonize our land and invade our people," and McNamara was saying, "No, we didn't. We didn't want that. We just wanted to stop you guys being oppressed by the communists." And he's like realizing that they're actually fighting two completely different wars because they weren't actually able to listen to each other. Anyway. So Giordano asked, would recycling plastic fit in this too? Yeah, look, another great point, right? Recycling plastic is originally a program developed by the fossil fuel industries. That's correct. The oil industries invented recycling plastic. Why? So they can sell more plastic. And back in the 70s, we used to say reuse, recycle. What is it? Reduce, reuse, recycle. I don't know if that's still a thing. Reduce, reuse, recycle. Actually, reducing is really good. Recycling is, reusing is really good, actually. Recycling is the most useless of all of them, but that's the only one that we're actually doing. and no one's actually doing any reducing or any reusing, even though these are actually effective. And instead we recycle everything. Recycling plastics is almost completely a waste of time. Recycling some things can be useful, glass, aluminium, and so on, but recycling plastics is kind of mostly just a marketing exercise. Sorry about that. Like it can be useful in certain circumstances, but it really is very marginal. There was a kind of a report from Exxon, the Exxon end of year report, a couple of years ago now. Happened to get my hands on it and to read it. It was kind of interesting. They were talking about facing increasing consumer resistance to using plastics. And so as a result of that, then they had to figure out more ways to use plastics in non-consumer facing contexts. So that's how these people think. Yeah. So the website, yeah, the NOAA laboratories, you can just Google or just search for global atmospheric CO2 and see the figures there. Obviously, this is under threat from the Trump administration. So far the website is still up, but much of the US science information is just gone, or websites are down. So hopefully this will remain. So Archana is sharing some interesting Jātaka monkey stories you grew up reading in India. Oh, that's interesting. So Archana, did you grow up in like a Hindu environment, or was it a Buddhist environment that you were reading these? Just be interested to know the context.
It was Hindu, yeah.
Sorry?
Hindu.
In a Hindu environment, and they were reading some Jātaka stories.
Yeah.
Oh, nice. Yeah. And some comments from Nilakshi, not having immediate consequences, right? They don't recycle as much as we think. Talking again about plastic recycling. Plus, we also need to buy what's made out of the recycled material, which happens to be more expensive. And yeah, and of course, the ultimate problem is really that plastic is incredibly complicated, and we think of plastic as being a thing, but in fact, it's an incredibly complex and diverse family of things, and you can't just throw a bunch of plastic in and just make more plastic out of it, because it's all different compounds and chemicals and so on. And it's still much cheaper to just pump oil out of the ground. I mean, you can't, ultimately, the problem with this is that you're placing the responsibility on the consumer, but that's not where you can solve it. You have to solve this by regulating the producers. And until we can start to do that effectively, then we're not really going to solve the problem. So Nilakshi is saying that we signed letters enough and more to change plastic wrappings and trays for fruit, and nothing has changed. Yeah, and yeah, it is really sad and really kind of depressing to see these things. I mean, there are obviously some attempts to make some laws to make changes, and I think there's a widespread perception that changes are needed. I mentioned a little while ago about where I met with this was at a conference where I met with the head of the CSIRO was there, and Major General Jeffreys, the former Governor General of Australia. For those of you who are not in Australia, the Governor General is the head of state of Australia, or the head of state theoretically is the then Queen, or now King of England, and the Governor General is their representative appointed by the King or Queen, mostly has a ceremonial role. Anyway, so this was a former, well-respected army general who had been the Governor General. So this is my point here, simply being that this is like the most conservative guy that you can possibly imagine, right? I mean, he's a general in the army and then gets appointed by the Queen to be the Governor General and preside over state ceremonies. And he and his wife were saying, we need to ban plastic, which I found quite striking, right? That this is not just a kind of a sort of not just among the hippie weirdos who I normally hang out with, but even in the respectable parts of society, people really realize that we need radical changes with these things. Okay, look, I am going to have to leave. There is a knock on the door, and I know what that means. So thank you so much, everybody, for attending and for bearing with me through this course. Thanks so much to Rob for organizing everything and putting it on. And Rob, you're doing an incredible service for the community and for the Dhamma to bring people together in this kind of way. and for all of the crap that's happening, one of the things that still really means something is to have some community, and especially some spiritual community. And I think that this is like really important. Something for us to bear in mind also is that for each of us also to try to find community in our own region. And many of you may have community already, or maybe you don't, but to try to have community in your area, or if you don't, to try to create community in your area, bring people together. Because there are a lot of people who have a lot of anxiety, a lot of people who feel lonely, a lot of people who feel lost and confused. And we can all try to do something to reach out to others and to try to uplift people with the Dhamma. So thanks everybody for everything that we've done. Sume, terima kasih to you as well for being here. And Terawan Saranai to Ananda. And hopefully we will, for the folks in Sydney, be seeing you in a couple of weeks, and for other folks, hopefully we will organise another event sometime soon. Oh, and just a quick advertisement, I am doing another course with the Sati Center on suttas later in the year, so check that out if you want to join with that one. So thanks so much, Rob. I do have to go, so see you all again. Be happy. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
Sadhu, sadhu.
Sadhu.